All right, this morning we're picking up or continuing with the life of Abraham. We have 3 more classes, including this one, to spend discussing some of the things that Abraham experienced and the principles that apply to our lives. Some really good stuff here. I'd like to talk, first of all, about 2 topics relative. I'm going to approach Abraham's experience topically. First of all, I'd like to look at Abraham in terms of his responses. His responses to God's call and the effects of his waywardness. I'd like to focus in primarily on the waywardness of Abraham, although Abraham has some very positive things. So just a few moments on that. In Genesis chapter 12, what we looked at last week, this is a little review. What are the 3 conditions that God set before he would bless Abraham? All right. And he had to leave first his land, then his family, then his father's house. Or maybe it's the other way around. Okay. Let's stay in Genesis 12:2. Now the life of Abraham is, at least the chronology that we have in the scriptures, is a pretty clear indication as to when Abraham responded to this positively and what happened to him when he did not. I'd like to just focus on that. At first, Abraham did leave. Genesis chapter 11, verses 27 to 32 tells us that he did leave. So first step, he left in partial obedience. He left his father's land. The end results of this, and we touched on it, so that the end results of his partial obedience rather than merely his full obedience was that he had wasted years. Now, how many more children could Abraham have begotten if he had simply gone straight there and done it? Wasted years. Chapter 11, verses 27 to 32, which describes Abraham taking took Lot and Aaron's son, Aaron's son and Sarah.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Thank you.
Okay. Because chapter 12 says that the Lord had said to Abraham prior to this time, so he was acting in response to God's instruction. Partial obedience. All right, now we come to chapter 12, verse 4, and we have the second stage in Abraham's obedience. Here we have him leaving his father's house. He's already left the land. Now he's leaving his father's house. It says, Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken unto him. And Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he departed of the parents. So he's leaving whatever relatives he has up there. And this is partial obedience, isn't it? Once again, he's... I don't know why he took Lot. It doesn't tell us why he took Lot, but you can imagine that there were some good, rational reasons for it. Now, there are a number of results of Abraham taking Lot with him, and Lot being there with him was something that shouldn't have happened. For one thing, and we're talking about the ramifications or the effects of Abraham's waywardness here. What did Abraham almost immediately do when he got into the land of Canaan? Verses 9, 10, 11, and following. What did Abraham do? Yes, he didn't stay there, and because there was a famine, it was pretty tough, and so he went south into Egypt. And as a result, he displayed a very poor testimony. If Abraham had obeyed God in the first place, Lot wouldn't have seen this about Abraham. Secondly, well, I'd just like to note, I want you to see that chapter 13, verse 1, it says, Abraham went up out of Egypt at the end of this episode with Sarah and Pharaoh. He and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. Right? Now it's apparent that from the next verse that Abraham had become very rich. He probably wasn't poor to begin with, but at the end of his sojourn in Egypt, Abraham had been treated very well by Pharaoh, and he had all kinds of cattle and slaves and everything. You know, this is one of the things that he got down there. So as a result of his taking Lot with him, Lot saw this. He saw his own uncle live like this. He saw how that Abraham got rich. Now think about what happened to Lot eventually. Lot eventually made similar mistakes in the same two areas, you know. Lower standards of morality and the desire for wealth or worldly values. And it was those two things perhaps that Abraham was responsible for cultivating in Lot's life because he took him with him. He should have left him. And maybe Lot could, you know, we don't know, but you can surmise that or postulate that maybe if Abraham had left Lot and Haran in the first place when he was seeking to obey God, that Lot wouldn't have seen this, and maybe Lot's own experience would have turned out very, very differently because he hadn't had this early. We all look up to older people, especially influential people, relatives, and so there's no doubt a psychological effect that was implanted in Lot because of Abraham's partial obedience. So he was a bad testimony to Lot. Secondly, another ramification was that God's best plan for Abraham became complicated as a result. God's best plan for Abraham became complicated. For example, in chapter 10, verse 12, when it says originally that Abraham went down into Egypt to sojourn because of the grievousness of the famine, might we say that Abraham might not have even gone down into Egypt if he hadn't had Lot, and we may presume the things that Lot had? Apparently Lot had a good deal of possessions, because in chapter 13 it says in verse 5, Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents, and the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. Now, whether Lot was like this before they went down into Egypt or simply as a result, it's not clearly stated. But it's not improbable that Lot had many possessions to begin with, and if Abraham had left him in Haran, that the crisis over, his compromise down in Egypt over Sarah may never have taken place, because he wouldn't have needed to go down into the land because of the famine. He might have been able to survive in Canaan. So plan A was scrapped, and Abraham experienced plan B, which was less than good. See? And it resulted in another step that there wasn't enough room for both Abraham and Lot in the land, and so this caused there was strife. Chapter 13, verse 7. The land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together. There was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle. There was unnecessary conflict in their experience. Just an application on this. Has not Christ told us to go into all the world and preach the gospel? Hasn't he told us to be willing to leave father and mother and children and wife and possessions and houses? Hasn't he told us to be willing to do that? If we're going to serve the Lord, we have to be willing to separate. Now, a Christian who, like Abraham, only separates from part of it, or is only willing to separate from part of it, is going to similarly complicate their life. You see that? The principle is there. If we don't go all the way, then we could be putting ourselves in a situation like Abraham, where we're dragging stuff into our further Christian experience that is simply going to make it more difficult for us. It's going to complicate it. It's going to force us into situations that we might not be forced into if we hadn't brought the stuff with us. So, there's relevance to that. It causes strife. Sometimes churches would be better off if half the people were missionaries instead of everybody sitting in the pews, stumbling over one another, fighting to do a job that it only takes one person to do. You know? I think what some churches need to do is just send some people away, get them busy. All right, so in chapter 13, verse 10, because there wasn't enough room back in Canaan for Abraham and Lot to live together side by side, I want you to see that Abraham was indirectly responsible for Lot ending up in Sodom. It was Abraham that took Lot. See, verse 8 through 10. And Abraham said to Lot, "Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between your herdsman and thy herdsman. We are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself, I pray thee, from me." Actually, God had told Abraham to separate his own self from Lot. But Abraham was weak, apparently. And so he requests that Lot separate from him. And whatever Lot does, Abraham will take the other option. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. And Lot chose the plain. Verse 11. So Abraham then was indirectly responsible for the bad choice that Lot made. If Abraham had obeyed God fully in the first place, then Lot perhaps would not have made this choice. There would have been no need to. Chapter 14, almost the entirety of chapter 14 is dedicated to tell us the story of what? What happened in chapter 14? Right. These kings from Babylon, from the far east, came over, and they did a number on those 5 cities in the Decapolis, of which Lot he just happened to be in the road. He got caught up in this war. All right? An innocent bystander, and he was captivated. Now, think about it. If Abraham had done originally what God said to do and left Lot back in Haran, would Abraham have had to be distracted from what he was already doing Would Abraham have had to risk his life? Would Abraham have had to spend a few days, whatever it was, and the money it took and everything, to go down there and chase these guys around until he got them?
Would Abraham not have that? Compared to the priesthood of Melchizedek?
Well, that's an interesting point. Maybe it shows us that God is quite capable of working things out for our good, since he knows the mistakes we're going to make anyway. It's very evident that Melchizedek is a key figure in the life of Abraham. However, we could easily postulate that God could have worked out a similar relationship between Abraham and Melchizedek in a better way, rather than just as a result of Abraham being victorious in rescuing Lot. I don't know how it would have happened. I can't imagine, but so what we're seeing here then is Abraham is being distracted from his primary responsibilities, even though God blessed it. And I think you could say that this is one of the ramifications of Abraham's original choice to only partially obey God. Chapters 18 and 19. Remember the story? Abraham is standing in his tent, or sitting in his tent with his old wife. Three guys walk up to the tent flap and say, "Hi, what's for dinner?" What was that story all about? Why were the guys there? Actually, this was God and two angelic messengers visiting Abraham, because the Lord was there, and Abraham talked with the Lord directly. See? He communed with him. And they were there to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, do you think that Abraham had any anxiety as a result of this situation? If he'd left Lot back home, Lot wouldn't have been there. Abraham likely wouldn't have gone through all the trauma, the emotional anxiety and everything that he went through, because Lot happened to be down there. See? So, again, you can interpret a lot of the details subsequent to Abraham's being down in the land with Lot to a failure on Abraham's part to do exactly what God had said in the first place, to fully obey and leave his own family back there. All of them. Now, God doesn't tell us not to take our families, but he told Abraham, this was Abraham's specific case, and it's showing us how we should respond to the clear instructions of the Word of God ourselves, that when it says, "Be not conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind," it doesn't mean just some of the time. It means all of the time. It doesn't mean when you want to. It means fully. See? Now let's think about some of the other experiences in Abraham's life. In chapter we have been focusing on these things right here. That because Abraham procrastinated in leaving his family. So that was the primary problem that Abraham had in the first years of his life with the Lord, is procrastination. This is number one. Now there are other problems that we see with Abraham that have nothing to do with procrastination. And we see Abraham making mistakes. Another one was leaving the land. Had God told him to leave the land? No. The original command was, leave your own land and go to a land that I will show you. He never said, when you get there, leave it. Right? And this is kind of an interesting point that's behind the story of Ruth. In the story of Ruth, you have a woman, is it Naomi? Yeah. Naomi and Elimelech, and then they have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And this family, it says, leaves Bethlehem Ephratah. And they go where? Where was it moved from? Right, Moab. They were inveterate enemies of Israel. But I guess there was good food down there. Right? So this is a picture of a person leaving the place that God wants them to be, and they go into the world. And in the world, they shrivel up and die spiritually. Well, they physically died. Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion all died. And in the picture, in the story, it's illustrating that in the world there's nothing but spiritual death. See? And it's only when Naomi comes back into the land, into the place of God's blessing, where God said he would bless his people in the land. That's where he promised them, the Palestinian covenant. That Naomi is blessed with a grandson, see? Obed, the grandfather of David. Okay, so this principle of Jews remaining in the land to be blessed by God starts back in the life of Abraham, because God had said in Genesis chapter 12 that if you leave your land, and if you leave your father's house, and if you leave your family and go to the land, there I will bless you. Right? That was the implication. And so Abraham made a couple of mistakes. Once he went to Egypt. We've already alluded to that in chapter 12. Chapter 12. And then later on he went in chapter 20 down to the Negev. Anybody know what the Negev is in relationship to Jerusalem? On a map. Jerusalem is here, the north end of the Dead Sea. Judah runs, the boundary of Judah basically runs straight over from the bottom of the Dead Sea up to Jerusalem. Right? And the Negev is the south country, south of Judah and north of the wilderness of Paran, which is like halfway to Mount Sinai. Right? So you've got the Sinai desert, you've got the wilderness of Paran and Sin, and then you've got the Negev. And this is the Negev, and Beersheba is way down here, right, in the middle of the Negev, Philistine country. Right? So basically, Abraham was walking out of the place, or if he wasn't actually leaving the land, in this case, in the Negev, he was at least down in somebody else's territory, or the border, compromising a little bit. And every time Abraham went down out of the land, what did he do? The consequences of leaving the land. In every case, right, moral, I don't know what you'd call it. Is it degenerate, or like he himself didn't actually do anything really bad. It was just that he made lousy decisions, right? But moral compromises, I guess would be a better word, right? As a result of leaving the land, he morally compromised, and as a result of that, lost his testimony in both cases. And as a result of that, he brought God's judgment on the people around him. I think it's interesting that God said to Pharaoh, don't touch that woman or you're a dead man. And Elimelech and Abimelech, the king of Beersheba, he said, you have another man's wife in your harem. Right? And that's why nobody can have any kids. If you read those two chapters, maybe I've got the stories mixed up, but the point is that God himself brought judgment on unsaved people because of the lousy testimony and the bad results coming from the actions that are Christian. And I believe that, and I've seen this happen, I have seen unsaved people make decisions and do things that God is going to judge them for. And they're going to reap bad consequences in their own lives because they are responding to a situation in which a Christian has compromised in the world. You know, I've seen it. I've seen some of our Christian young people just go right into the world, fully well knowing what they're doing, and as a result, they have caused some of their unsaved friends to be turned off to spiritual things because of what they're like. See? And what is that going to do to the unsaved person? Well, admonish one another. You confront the Christian, and you try to witness to the unsaved. That's all. Point out this person claims to be a Christian and they're a rotten example, so don't take them.
No, that's nice.
Beat them thing. There was one other significant mistake that Abraham made in his life. One other significant mistake that Abraham made in his life. Abraham responded the wrong way to the promise of a son. We all know the story that he went into Hagar in chapters 16 and 17. Right? So his compromise with Hagar. Oh, by the way, this is
more of a compromise with his wife.
I suppose maybe a compromise isn't the right word. Let's say impatience. Right? His impatience regarding Hagar. By the way, while we're talking about Hagar, does anybody know where Hagar came from? Egypt. Egypt. This was one of the end results of this very situation here. May never have happened in Abraham's life. Now get it. It may never have happened if he had never gone to Egypt. Because while he got down there, it says at the end of chapter 12 that he got many slaves. He got much cattle. He got very wealthy in the world. He got very wealthy. And those very things that he got backfired on him. And God used it in his life to tempt him. Remember what Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, that they that will be rich pierce themselves through... How does that go? This is a wonderful illustration of that principle. 1 Timothy chapter 6. I've seen this happen. I could give you names. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 8 and 9. Having food and raiment, let us therewith be content, but they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in perdition and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Now, Abraham deliberately left the land and the place of blessing. He went into the world and he got all kinds of wealth. God used that one of those very possessions that he got to be the source of a problem in Abraham's life later. A big problem. Big problem. And if he hadn't gone in the world in the first place, he most likely would never have had it. I had a Sunday school teacher when I was a kid. And he was starting to make some money. And he used that money for his, to build his business and stuff. Later on, he was known to have said, "There's nothing wrong with being rich as a Christian. Why can't Christians have yachts? And why can't Christians have these things and those things?" And that's the philosophy that he worked on. Instead of doing what he was supposed to do with his money, he began to spend it lavishly on himself. As a result, this man became caught up more and more in things of the world and in the world's thinking. And this person then became unfaithful to his wife, and he forced his girlfriend to have an abortion. And God judged him. You know, those very things that he had backfired on him because that money and those possessions, God put him in a situation where people started to sue him. He started to lose the stuff that he had, right? And if he had just changed, if he hadn't had his attitude, his worldly attitude towards possession in the first place, it probably never would have happened. Very similar to this kind of situation. I've seen it happen. Now, what specifically resulted from Abraham's impatience regarding the promise of the son and his willingness to compromise, doing it the fleshly way?
In the long run, it became a nation that would fight against his own people.
Right. Ultimately, he caused, down the road, years later, he caused warfare and racial animosity, racial conflict between Arab and Jew. In chapter 16, verse 4, one of the first consequences was immediate. How did Hagar treat Sarah? She despised her. Yeah, he really did something really nice for his wife. I mean, his wife is the one that suggested it. Now, why? Maybe she was just trying to make Abraham feel good, or I don't know. Maybe she was feeling the social pressures herself so much that she just wanted to have a son regardless of how, so that she could say, I have a son. Even if in conversation she knew that it was only a legal son and not a physical son, and therefore she could unload the stigma of being childless in that society. Understand what I'm saying? Like, maybe this was her reasoning that we're speculating. Right? But it's quite possible that's the way she was reasoning. But it backfired on her, because as soon as Hagar, this voluptuous Egyptian maid, conceived, then she has one over on her pretty mistress. Hey, I'm able to have a kid and you can't. Ha ha ha. Sort of, I mean, that's putting it kind of. But it says that she despised her master's wife. By the way, Hagar became Abraham's wife. Right?
Might have made her think that she would be.
Right. So, the first result was an immediate result. Abraham's own wife was despised. And then it backfired on Abraham. You know the old story of the captain hollers at the first mate, and the first mate hollers at the second mate hollers at the third mate. Just to pass it down the chain of command, and finally it gets down to the lowest guy on the ship. So he walks into the captain's office and hollers at the captain's parrot, and the parrot squawks at the captain the next time he walks in. It always comes back, That's an illustration done by who was that? A famous American. That famous American artist. That's the Saturday Evening Post guy.
Oh, Rockwell.
Rockwell. Yeah, he did a thing on that. It's really good. If you ever get a chance, look at it. Anyway, the point is that it backfired on Abraham himself, because then Sarah got on Abraham's case. Why did you do this? Well, I did because you told me. In verse 5, Sarah said to Abraham, the wrong done me be upon you. The Lord judge between me and thee. And so Sarah, did just like Eve did that, and it's his fault. It's your fault. Right? So then Abraham gets an earful. Conflict between Abraham and his wife. Sarah is despised by her maid. Abraham is, they've got a problem now between him and his wife. Another problem that they never had before. That's right. In verse 6, then Abraham is forced to treat his new wife, with whom he's just had a son, which was a big deal. I mean, he finally got a son. And now he has to turn around and treat his second wife in a pretty callous way. We're talking about an emotional roller coaster from the highs to the lows here. Poor old Abraham. Really made him happy, didn't it? And Abraham said to Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand, do to her as it pleases you. And when Sarah dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. And, I'm sure it doesn't tell us, but you read between the lines, there's Abraham was suffering, and Hagar suffered. Everybody in the whole situation suffered. And later on, we read that, you've already touched on it, the racial conflict. This is one of the major things that I've been blessed by in my contemplation of looking at Abraham's life. The problems and the waywardness of Abraham, his procrastination, his waywardness and his fleshly impatience, they all had deep ramifications. Right? And I think that's why we're given this example. Of course, something very similar you see in the life of Jacob, even to a greater extent. By the way, this is something, mentioning the posterity. Everybody that was descended from the Jews in a Jewish family, the knowledge was passed from father to son, right? Oral tradition, like we were talking about in class last night, right? Isaac knew all about his own father because his father would have told him. And then Jacob would have known all about his grandfather because his father would have told him, right? And of course, that's how we got it. I mean, it finally came, the oral tradition, God said, Moses, write down this oral tradition. I'm sure Moses probably heard the stories and knew the stories. That's where they came from. It would have been passed down from generation to generation, and the details were all memorized by every generation. See? And so when when a poor little kid is hearing this for the first time, my grandfather did that. It's putting a seed.
I wasn't asleep that time.
All he was doing was...
I was following instructions, okay?
Do it when I'm out, not when I'm awake. Give me a heart attack. Holy cow.
We just had a student wake up, Ken. He claims that he wasn't sleeping, but I mean, how can you tell when the eyes are closed?
That time I wasn't. I didn't work. My goodness.
Sorry, Steve.
Well, I'm glad you did that. That was good. I appreciate that. Laughter makes the heart, does like good like a medicine or something?
Like a medicine.
Yeah. But I lost my point. The point that I was making is that some poor little kid hears for the first time, that his great-grandfather was an adulterer. Right? Well, that just, by human nature, that does something to you. There's a seed planted in your head there. Well, God bless my grandfather, but he was an adulterer. And right away you have almost like an incipient double standard there that, maybe it's not so bad anyway. Maybe you can sin and get away with it. A kid can, with a simple reasoning, could reason that way. It's not all that bad. That's what you see in the life of David. One sin with Bathsheba, right? And then David's own son, Solomon. He goes to the nth extreme. And Absalom. All of David's sons had moral problems. Right? Why? I think it was because of David. David's example. Right? And so, even in the following generations, you find that Jacob did almost identical, the same kind of thing that Abraham, his grandfather, did. Yeah. All right. So we'll leave that and